A very good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Memorare, hosted by the Rotaract Club of Colombo East in commemoration of the International Day of Remembrance and Tribute to the victims of terrorism. We have with us present this evening three distinguished panelists who have proven that age is not a barrier in making a difference in the world. All three of them are premier activists working at different levels in the spectrum that sees a better world for our generation. Our first panelist this evening is Shehara Herath. Shehara is a lawyer, journalist, and served as the consultant on human rights affairs to the 20th Speaker of the Parliament of Sri Lanka, Honorable Karu Jayasuriya. He is the founder of the Janapahana Foundation, which advocates for a Sri Lankan society with greater awareness on law and human rights. He worked as a journalist, news anchor, and presenter for the Sri Lanka Rupavahini Corporation and as a presenter at Sri Lanka Broadcasting Corporation. He has also worked as a researcher for the International Center for Ethnic Studies and Verite Research. He was elected the General Secretary of the Law Students Union of Sri Lanka during his time at Sri Lanka Law College and went on to become a senator at the Sri Lanka Youth Parliament from 2013 to 2015. So welcome on board, Shehara. It's nice to have you here this evening.
Fabian.
Our second panelist is Sashi Schaffter. Sashi is a research analyst working for a company based in the United Kingdom. She has a background in human rights law with a specialization in human trafficking, cyberspace, and state crime. Sashi completed her LLB honours at SOAS University of London and her Masters in Law at the Queen Mary University of London, where she had the opportunity to study terrorism and human rights, which examined the legal categorization surrounding the concept of terrorism from a constitutional perspective. Our third panelist this evening, of course, is a well-known media personality, Danu Innasithamby. Danu is the founder of Sri Lanka Smile, a project initiated by the Danu Innasithamby Foundation, and WTF. He is also the head of Channel High TV. He was elected as the brand ambassador of 444, in addition to holding the position of chairman of the PR and Media Committee Sri Lanka of the Asian African Chamber of Commerce and Industry. He holds an honorary doctorate and the Paramount Medallion from the World Peace and Diplomacy Organization. He was awarded with the title of Global Peace Ambassador by WPDO in recognition of his undying commitment towards sustaining world peace and harmony. In addition, he is currently a member of the National Committee of Sri Lanka Unites. So welcome on both Danu and Sashi.
Thank you.
And to kick off this evening, the first question that we would like the panel to take up and discuss. Basically, today we are commemorating the International Day of Remembrance and Tribute to the victims of terrorism. And I think the question that a lot of young people and people in general have in their mind is, why is it important to remember and pay tribute to the victims of terrorism? So Sashi, would you kick us off?
Sure. Thank you, Fabian. I think the main thing to remember when considering why it's important to pay tribute to victims of terrorism is so that we can, as a society, globally work towards eradicating terrorism and preventing future instances of terrorism. So it's not just about remembering the victims, but also how do we honor the victims? How do we prevent this from happening ever again?
Thank you, Sashi. Danu, do you agree or concur?
Definitely. I think sometimes we always say we need to forget about a certain thing and move on. But some things need to be reminded that we will not repeat it again. That's the whole purpose of it. And I think when we say victims, it's not only those who died in this very tragic past that we face. It's all those who are affected even in many ways than just death. Because I think sometimes when you are caught in the thick of terrorism, death is an access to freedom. Because when you have to face the repercussion of the war or any form of terrorism, I think it's too much, way more painful than actually like losing your life. You have to suffer through more pain even when you have to see your family go. So I think remembering all of these elements of terrorism is very important so that we can never ever repeat such a situation and destroy what we have as a nation.
It's a very interesting perspective, Danu. Shehara, do you have anything to add on to that?
Yeah, so I mean, Sri Lanka is a country which has been baffled with terrorism for almost 30 years, and even before that we have been having socialist uprisings, which some people term as terrorism. So in that context, I think people who suffer from terrorist acts are least remembered. When we talk about all people we remember, all tragic incidents we recall, for an example, people who die of or people who suffer due to natural disasters are often remembered and often commemorated. But rarely do we pay attention to those who suffer and die due to terrorist activities. So I think as a country, nationally, we need to emphasize more on people who actually suffered. We need to emphasize more on people who actually lost their lives, lost their family due to terrorist activities in the past. And if we don't do that, I don't think we can move forward as a nation if we simply put it under the carpet and move on.
Thank you, Shehara, for a very interesting perspective from all our panelists. And let's move on then. I think everyone touched base on how the most important aspect to commemorating and paying tribute to the victims of terrorism is to make sure that such atrocities are not committed again. And I think then we need to look at what exactly is terrorism. It is my understanding that terrorism has occasionally been said to be the radicalization of a thought and a solution sometimes to a social injustice. So how do you all view this? I'd like to pose this question maybe starting at Sashi, and then if everyone else could pitch in as well.
I think the first thing to note, Fabian, is that there is no agreed upon global definition of terrorism. So we have several international conventions which touch on it. We have domestic legislation in different countries which touches on what terrorism is, but there isn't a clear agreed upon definition. But I think the UN and international organizations have three basic aspects that they focus on which define terrorism. So the first would be that terrorism undermines basic human rights. The second would be that it undermines the state and it is a threat to the political process. And then the third would be that it's a threat to not just an individual country, but to international peace and security on a global level. So I think it's important to keep those three things in mind when thinking of what terrorism is and how to define it.
Sashi, just a follow-up question to that. You said that there are three components that the UN defines. The third component, is it mandatorily, like does an act of terrorism have to fulfill all three of these requirements, or is there a different standard that is applied there?
I think it's not that it has to fulfill those three requirements, but it's more that, so if there's a terrorist attack here, it wouldn't just be a threat to Sri Lanka, it would also be a threat to peace and security on a global level, right? It's that. But also I think the main aspect of terrorism, what differentiates terrorism from other acts of violence or other criminal acts, is that terrorism is committed with a political aim in mind or an ideological aim. And that's what differentiates terrorism from, say, just murder or any other act of violence. So it's that it's committed with political or ideological aims.
Thank you, Sashi. Shehara, anything to add on?
Yeah, so like she said, it's something really difficult to do, defining terrorism, because once again, even in Sri Lanka, we have so many uprisings and still people argue whether it's terrorism or not. So for me, what I see as terrorism is, in a very layman's term, is that if any person or an organization goes on and poses a violent threat to society, I would personally like to call them terrorism.
So you do not believe that they have to have a political ideology?
Not
at
exactly.
The center of it. Okay. Thank you, Shehara. Danu?
No, I think they cover. I think it's the same thing.
Okay.
It is the same way.
Of course. So thank you. And Danu, so since we left off with you, how does an individual wake up and decide that they're going to be a terrorist and perform these drastic atrocities against a fellow human being? What do you think the thought process is that goes into play for someone to wake up like that?
I think there are so many elements to it. Sometimes, so I'm talking about going back in time to my days in Jaffna. People who were like my dad's mechanic's son just joined the LTT movement because one day he woke up and he thought he should just serve. But did he inform anyone? No. Did the parents see it coming? No. But all what happened was within a week he was sent back dead. So I think it has a lot of elements to it. It's the type of conversations that you have, it's the things that you're exposed to, it's the things that you see, and the things that you are, if you are in a position of vulnerability where you could be fed information with no proper guidance for you to think of your own, I think it's very easy to make someone believe in a cause that's worthy or not. And at the same time, I think we humans believe in this mob mentality. If you do take, I'm sure I was not born in 83, but yet there are stories of how people are so shocked. Like these people came to nearly burn my house, to kill me. But these are all people who have lived in the same society, in the same environment. They have been shopping in the same shops. They have gone to same church. They might have gone to the same temple. But how did they turn against each other is the fact that if I take a knife and kill you, it's murder. But if the three of us join and do it, it was some kind of revenge act. So it becomes, oh, it's right. So it's like a mob mentality. That's why up to date, from the simple signs of even bullying, could go into a form of terrorism, of the fact that just because one person is being bullied and it becomes a laughable matter to the other two, then they are like, then from there it goes into two, then it becomes a group of people, then that one person becomes the victim of it. So if that person dies, who do you blame? Because there's a huge amount of people, there's like a mob. So I always feel that terrorism has a huge aspect to how you actually sit and think. When I was a kid, I have had LTTE soldiers, and I was 6.5, seated at the entrance of our house in Jaffna, have come and asked me, join the movement. For a 6.5-year-old boy, I think like an icy chalk would have been good enough for me to go carry a gun. So I think it's how, in what situation you are in, that sort of leads you into this. And sometimes people who are there exactly don't even understand the thought process as to why they're there. Most of the LTT movement people, some of the kids who joined for better life in Jaffna during the harder times. I don't think they even believed or knew the exact cause of it.
Thank you, Danu. Sashi, could we maybe have a global perspective on this? So I think Danu touched very locally, but where do you think this falls on the spectrum of a global scale?
Globally, Fabian, I think the main thing to keep in mind is, the question you posed was, how do terrorists commit atrocity towards their fellow human beings? But the important thing to remember is that individuals who are radicalized do not view the rest of us as human beings. They are so desensitized to their victims that they don't see what they're doing as wrong. And that's the crucial element there, is that they don't see themselves as doing something wrong. No one really brands themselves as a criminal, right? It's quite rare. Most people think that they are, and that's where the ideological aims come in as well. They are individuals who are radicalized and who are turned into extremists. They believe that they're acting for a purpose that is greater than just themselves as an individual. So they see every act they commit as necessary to achieve their aims, which of course we would see as completely illegitimate aims, but they see themselves as committing these acts of violence against people who, they don't really deem people, they don't deem as their equals, they don't value that human life which they're taking. So that's what you need to really see it as, I think.
Thank you, Sashi. So I think we've touched a lot of broad topics here, and now let's try and maybe slice this up into smaller segments so that our audience could properly understand these various aspects that seem to come into play. As Danu said, it's a very vast topic that we need to really delve into. So this is my opinion. I strongly believe that terrorism in its current state is a very modern development. I mean, like if you look at history books prior to 1916, 1917, you wouldn't really see the word terrorist being used. So I think the first time where it was properly utilized was in the assassination of Elizabeth of Austria-Hungary when she was on holiday, where a French anti-monarchist went to kill the Duke of Orleans, who was then heir to the French throne, and then he failed in the attempt, and then he decided to shoot the wife of the King of Austria-Hungary, just as a matter of course. And as a modern development today, where do its origins lie on a global scale, Sashi? Because I think this is something that you've really delved into as a whole. So where did terrorism really have its origin in the current state we see today?
Again, Fabian, the difficulty with defining terrorism leads to difficulties in actually pinpointing its origin. If you don't have a clear definition, how can you discuss when something started, right? So it's several scholars have differing opinions on this. I mean, some scholars actually argue that Nazi Germany was a form of terrorism, but then it raises questions about whether a state can be considered to be committing state terrorism. So I think it's very hard globally to pinpoint when terrorism started, just because we don't have a clear definition of what it is. But historically, of course, there are acts of violence which now are being interpreted as terrorism with hindsight.
I see. Thank you, Sashi. And Shehara, maybe if you could add on this aspect. Like I think Sashi also touched on, like there seems to be a very blurred line between the definition of whether or not a state can commit terrorism. So what is your opinion on this as an up and coming politician in Sri Lanka? What do you hold?
Well, if you look at reality, you see different states are threatened by terrorists. Always states are seen as victims of terrorists rather than terrorists themselves. But for me, if a state or if state-controlled parties go beyond their mandate, go beyond what they are supposed to do under the constitution or under law, I think that goes into an anti-state within the state itself. Do you understand?
Yes.
So for an example, let's say the government suddenly decides to go on a rampage beyond their limits, okay, misusing their power, going beyond the power which is given to them by law. If that happens, then those individuals can actually be a part of a terrorist force. So for me, if a government goes beyond their legitimacy, it can form into a terrorism. So in that context, I think even Nazi Germany can fall under terrorism, and certain government-led mobs, even in 1983, could fall into the category of terrorism. So, I mean, there's like I said, it's a very blur area. It's a gray area which we can't really, demarcate. But for me, I personally think the government can actually be a terrorist at a certain point, the moment they give up on their legitimate mandate.
Since both of you are the legal experts, Sashi and Shehara, let me draw you into a conversation here. So you say that when the government bypasses its legal mandate, but if we look at Nazi Germany was well within its legal mandate to commit all the atrocities that it did. We had the Nuremberg regulations that came into play, demarking basically non-Aryan citizens as not being citizens altogether and forfeiting the rights that would otherwise be afforded citizens. So Sashi, do you concur with Shehara on this, on the definition that he chose to take?
It's not that I disagree with him. I understand exactly what he's saying. I think there's a difference between terrorism and other forms of violence. Can a state commit violence? Definitely. Some forms of violence are legitimate, like states have their own military. That's not illegitimate. But then you obviously do have illegitimate forms of violence that the state can be involved in, like Nazi Germany, for instance. But now I think that's why it's important to have universal standards. That's why we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We have even the European Convention on Human Rights, so that there are some universal standards which are agreed upon, so that it's not based on each individual state's domestic legislation, but it's about having universal standards which apply to everyone just on the basis that they are human. Rights afforded to them on the basis of that humanity. So tomorrow if a country decides to change its legislation and, bring in violence against a particular group, that would still be illegitimate from a global perspective. it doesn't make it right. Do you understand what I'm saying?
We understand. Thank you so much, Sashi. That's a very, I think that sort of a debate is very important for us to understand. So basically what you're touching on is the fact that pogroms cannot be termed as terrorism because it has to be defined as such and it has to be act against the state. Am I correct?
No, I didn't say that. I said that there can definitely be acts of violence that the state is involved in, wherever that may be in the world. But whether it's terrorism or not is a very difficult question, and there's no consensus on this. Scholars and people in the academia totally disagree on this. There isn't an agreed upon definition. Can a state be violent? Yes. Does that mean that it's state terrorism? It's not as clear. It's a very grey area.
Thank you, Sashi. I think we've all touched vaguely on terrorism and its origins, but and also I think Danu also spoke to us about how recruitment processes happen in terms of terrorist organization. So, as a media personality, Danu, would you agree that there is a general glorification of violence that we see by news media and by media in general? And do you or do you not concur that at one point this is free advertising for massive terrorist organizations, especially ISIS? I think read a lot on Western media's portrayal of them to recruit people who lived in the West to come out into Syria and Iraq and join the ISIS. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I will not solely blame mainstream media. I think we are all in some way affiliated to media today.
Of course.
I think anyone who uses a mobile phone is someone who has the power to influence another person, and that is simply media. If you can pass a message to someone, that's a form of media. But I just feel that, let's say if all state media decides not to ever report anything about terrorism, there'll be another radical movement that will start to just promote that. There'll be a terrorism TV channel that will start just to put news like that. So there's always going to be an outlet in terms of this, and sometimes media speaking about it, there are two elements to it. I think in any form of media, I think we can either use social media or whatever for the good or the bad. So however much that we use it for the good, we also use it for the bad. If you, at one time we tried to ban the social media in our country, it just crippled us because we all did the wrong thing by finding another way to get on it, to still promote what we were trying to promote. So I think, media may give the recognition and publicity and things like that to the fact that there is a terrorist organization. But it's also a mode of information so that somebody who has a rational brain will actually sit and think, okay, that's terrorism, and not just generally think, oh, that's a nice place for me to walk into and start bombing people. So it's just going to be it's a debatable story, because I really feel that anyone can create that kind of a rapid fire.
I see. Thank
I
you.
think there was terrorism even in the days when there was no CNN and BBC reporting on ISIS.
No, I think the question was more on the lines of
do we give
the glorification of violence that we see in media today. All movies tend to go towards a violent tinge, and even for example, if you look at newspapers from the 1930s and the 1920s, you'd see them reporting on births, marriages and deaths. But now it's just violence, violence, violence. Don't you think at one point that draws the youth into this whole system of what I think media personality has termed glorification of violence?
Maybe, but there's also this, if you do, I think as a media organization that I've worked in many, whenever we have done a research as to what are the most viewed newsworthy videos on YouTube, it's always accidents. And we are always left wondering, why do people want to see two vehicles collide and people die? But it's just, I think there's some kind of a satisfaction. But I'm just so worried about the fact at the same time, why is there a satisfaction? So it may not be reported, but yet somebody who has taken it with their phone and put it up gets a lot of traction. So I think even if that's what I said, even if one person blocks it, there's going to be other channels that will maneuver it. But yet, violence has become the most, even if you take the most commercial film, you'll have somebody fighting against someone and killing someone. And it's just become very normal. Yeah, so it's a bit of a problem.
Of course. Thank you, Danu. That was a very interesting perspective. And I think we all started this with the fact that memorializing victims of terrorism is very important so that we can alleviate any possibility of these things taking place again. So obviously, everyone touched on the fact that every state in the world has some form of counterterrorism measures. So I'd like to pose this question to Sashi. Counterterrorism policies around the world as they exist has gotten a lot of criticism because it seems to infringe on the civil liberties that a democracy promises its citizens. What are your thoughts on this?
Counterterrorism, Fabian, it's an area which has obviously developed a lot in recent history. After the 9/11 attack in the US particularly, counterterrorism measures were made more stringent. Your question was about counterterrorism infringing on civil liberties, right? I think it's very difficult to answer because states, obviously, they have to balance the protection of civil liberties and the rule of law with also an effective counterterrorism policy. It's an area that is so contentious because with counterterrorism, it raises questions like torture. So in the EU, for instance, there is a prohibition on torture in the the Convention on Human Rights. So even with regard to counterterrorism, torture is prohibited, and that's based on having this standard that even with regard to counterterrorism, even when keeping in mind counterterrorism mechanisms, we are not going to drop down to that level where we torture individuals who are suspected. So I think it's very difficult for states to balance counterterrorism with protecting civil rights and liberties. But if states keep in mind the principle of the rule of law and just protecting the rule of law in their countries, then they'll be better placed to balance counterterrorism laws with civil liberties.
Thank you. Shehara, on that point, I'd like to raise this question at you. We saw, one of the worst acts of terrorism in the recent past was the Easter bombings that rocked Sri Lanka last year. And after that was over, I think, like Sashi said, counterterrorism measures are important aspect to this, that a state needs to fulfill. But we noticed a lot of, how would you term it, as maybe a downpour on searches and an infringement of the rights of Islamic citizens in Sri Lanka. What are your thoughts on this? Like, do you have any thoughts, if at all? And if so, what role do you think the government could have played to not infringe on civil liberties as much as possible?
So here, this is a very interesting topic because now you find a ground where you have to balance between rights. So a state is in a position whether, in order to protect the lives and freedoms of the citizens, whether you infringe on certain rights to publish things, certain rights to move about, certain rights to speak out, certain rights to demonstrate. So this is a very difficult question, and also sometimes it could lead to misuse.
Of course.
Many governments misuse these policies just to, to enforce their whims and fancies. But in such a situation, I think one thing is, of course, like she said, internationally there are certain guidelines on how a government should act in counterterrorism measures. Just to bring some legal jargon to it, the International Law Commission, which met in Delhi, I can't remember the year though, they gave out a list of things which a government should look into while ensuring counterterrorism mechanisms, and among them are, ensuring basic human rights, not going into torture, using force as it is necessary, and also ensuring that the justice system works fine. So when we take into consideration whether the counter-terrorism reaction of the government in the aftermath of the Easter Sunday attacks, what we see is one thing, the government was taken by shock of the Easter Sunday bombings, which I think was much different to the earlier situation where we were having a 30-year war and the government knew that anytime any place could get bombarded. But here we see a series of bombings happening suddenly in an unprepared state.
Of course.
So of course that there were many things the government had to balance at that point. One thing was the rising xenophobia or rising Islamophobia among the general masses. On the other hand, they were in a difficult position to look into who were actually behind these attacks. They were also in a position. They were in a difficult position when it comes to the economy due to the Easter Sunday bombings. So while battling with all of these issues, the government did certain acts to immediately investigate into this, but certain acts I think were targeted at a particular community which should not have happened. But I'm not saying I justify all the acts the government did, but to a certain extent, limiting people's freedom, limiting people's rights to a certain level in a situation of terrorism is justified. But the place we need to draw the line is the moment it becomes, it goes beyond the purpose, like enforcing xenophobia against a particular community, or using anti-terrorism mechanisms, counter-terrorism mechanisms to attack a political opponent.
Of course. I think now that you've brought the topic up, I know we didn't plan to discuss this per se, but I think it's very important for us to draw in the argument of Hezbollah. What are your opinions on that?
Which argument of his?
As in the fact that he has been held without charges up until now merely for representation, legal representation, which is again a civil liberty, and as a lawyer it is his duty. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so one thing of course is as a lawyer, I think the Bar Association, we have clearly set out our protests when it comes to the arrest of Hezbollah, who is a prominent attorney at law in Sri Lanka. But and we have obviously objected to it, and personally I feel that a person should not be held up in detention for so long without proper charges. But on the other hand, the government is of the opinion that this investigation might lead into something good, but still we haven't found any solid material or anything which holds water to bring charges against him. So personally, I think it's a very arbitrary arrest or a detention, and personally I'm not, if there was something to be investigated 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks is fine, but and without giving a proper justification, if a person is held in detention beyond that, personally is a violation of his rights, and as we say, another person's violation is also a violation of the entire community.
Of course. Thank you, Shehara. Danu, to touch on that, I think Shehara spoke about a rise in xenophobia, and I mean, as somebody who's a very influential public figure, I suppose over the years we've always seen whenever there is an act of violence committed by a terrorist organization, there has been a massive backlash on the communities that these terrorist organizations claim to represent. So what are your thoughts on the state of affairs that sadly happens to be the rule in the country?
Well, I think if you do go back to the point where the issues that we faced with the bombings, as much as we had to protect our country, we should not generalize it, and we should not just put it out, this particular race or this particular kind is the problem. I think we need to bring it down to the fact that the act of terrorism was done because somebody believed in something, not that everyone as a community believed in it. So I think differentiating that and making sure I think it's the government's responsibility, and anyone who is in a power of leadership should always project that we as a country are promoting togetherness, but we as a country are opposing and letting go of terrorism, no matter from where it comes from. So it should not be a part of religion, or it should not be something that you create a phobia about, but you create a phobia against terrorism. I think that's the best phobia to create.
How do you think Sri Lanka is basically coping in terms of how you think we should be acting?
I think sometimes our political leaders also lose their handle and just quickly trash a kind, or depending on the votes that will come just before an election. I think playing the religion card, the race card, the language card, the caste card, all of these cards have had a huge effect. Because up to now, our voter base is, yeah, that mindset should go. What he or she will do for our country should be the question. But up to now, every time there's an election, good enough, you vote for 5 years, nothing happens. We just see 2 or 3 headlines on some paper, and again we are back after the 5th year answering the same question. This doesn't prove anything. I think as long as if we are ever going to vote for a person who uses these cards, we are the fools, not them, because they get what they want. They enter parliament.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you, Danu. I think that's a very very important thing for all of the youth to really take in and digest. And I'd like to pose this question to Sashi. So I think right now we've been talking about the propaganda that goes into terrorism. And do you think that on a global scale there is a linkage between economic deprivation and terrorism and recruitment to terrorist organizations? Because I think that's something that we didn't see in the Easter bombings, and we'd like to know what is the perspective on a global scale, and then maybe let's try and digest it onto a local mechanism.
Absolutely, Fabian. I think there's a very clearly established link between economic deprivation and susceptibility to extremism and radicalization on a global scale. For example, I can refer to Europe again, and those who left their countries to join ISIS. There's been so much research done into this. There's a very clear established link between petty crime and those involved in petty crime and those who left European countries to join ISIS. You see, a lot of them had minor criminal convictions against them. A lot of them came from economically deprived backgrounds. Interestingly, a lot of them also came from single parent homes. And I think that just speaks to the vulnerability of these individuals. They didn't have a lot of clear guidance in their lives. They didn't have bright futures ahead of them, right? And so they were very, very vulnerable to being radicalized, and they ended up finding some sort of solace in this ideology, which of course is a very harmful ideology. And I think there was an article I read a few years ago, which was really sad. It interviewed mothers of young boys who had left their countries to go and join ISIS, and a lot of them they had no idea. You know, for them, they saw their sons who had been involved in gang violence, who'd been involved in petty crime, suddenly turn their lives around. They saw them, they saw a huge change in them, which they thought was positive initially, but that change was actually caused by this radicalization and the fact that they didn't see themselves as individuals per se, but they saw themselves as being involved in a cause which they formed their identity on. So there's a clear link between economic deprivation and also crime and terror.
Just to add to that, I think they were isolated within their communities.
Yes.
Even at their homes, they felt isolated. It could either be a problem with the society not understanding them, or them not understanding the society. So that isolation was a perfect place for terrorism to come and give them the wholesomeness that they have always wanted. So it's just a matter of we identifying those who are just idling and not trying to figure out what they want to do in life and giving them the path to think. Because I don't think everyone has the capability of thinking and going forward. And sometimes the people who we lose to terrorism are sometimes some of the smartest people who actually have the potential of doing something greater using that same knowledge.
Of course, Danu. Since we're on the topic, I think something that we need to strongly confront is there's a lot of psychological studies that have presented the millennial profile. I think we all fall into that scope, and the millennial profile says very strongly that millennials seek purpose in life, and they really want to make a change. That's why we see so much of social activism. So would you say that terrorism seems to be an outlet for the youth to achieve this sense of purpose and social activism that other people seem to be achieving through the liberal through liberal activism? That this is just another form of diverging that same sense of energy. Danu?
Well, that's a very tough. It could be, or it. I'm just so confused. If you do take the attack that we had in April, all those news that came out afterwards, if you do remember that video of this man with the backpack walking to the church, where he pets the child's head at the start, I will never think that person will, because I would have expected somebody who is into terrorism would have kicked the child and maybe walked over the child to get into church. Not exactly pet the child and move her so gently. And I still remember that, and I thought to myself, at that moment, we saw the element of humanity there.
Yes.
And at the same time, if you do remember the Shangri-La bombers, when they were coming up the lift, they had conversation, they had a wholesome laugh. What was that sight to them? So, yeah, I think the millennials want to find the purpose, because I think we are correcting most of the problems that our parents and their parents created. It could be war, it could be even diabetes, or it could be even the fact of what we have let go as pollution in this country.
Yeah.
I think we are more concerned about what we throw, what we eat, in terms of the intake of sugar. We have done too much of research towards it. I just feel that we should also do research towards where we generate our attention to. Like, there is good and the bad, and sometimes the bad looks good because the good is not good enough. And it's quite scary, because I just feel that these people who are radicalized are just like that other person, because for me, I'm just studying, because for me, when I watch those videos, I actually wanted to think from their perspective, because the one who couldn't get his bomb to go off at Taj Samudra went back and prayed. Did he pray for the fact that the bomb didn't go off and ask for forgiveness for the fact that it didn't go off? Or did he pray over the fact that I'm happy that the bomb didn't go off? So confusing, because there was a moment of, you find a solemn peace in when you pray, whatever religion it is. So it's so confusing. There is a human element to it, and that's the same human element that's driving them to do this, and be happy about those families that are going to scream in pain what they're going to face. So it's utterly confusing. It's just, for me, I'm in doubt still. It's like tomorrow I just take a gun and shoot people. Like today, if you ask me, would you do it? I'll just say, no, I can never think of that. So that's where I'm also in doubt. How do they just flip the coin? I don't know. I'm sure you all will have a better understanding on this.
Sashi, do you want to add on to that, perhaps on a global scale? Because I think Danu was touching base on Sri Lanka, but I think terrorism is a global pandemic.
Because for us, it's the closest terrorism act that we have seen is what we faced on
last
Easter.
April.
Yeah.
I think again it just speaks to the mental element involved. So we can't relate to these individuals because we could never imagine doing what they did or what they have done. But it just goes to show how warped their perception of reality also is, because if you can bring yourself to commit a mass atrocity and then convince yourself that you are the hero in that situation, it just shows that your perception of reality itself is deeply skewed. So that's what I would add to that.
Thank you, Sashi. To build on to that, I'd like to pose this question to Shehara. I think you were very, very involved on a political spectrum during the years that the UNP government held sway. And for better or for worse, or due to no fault of their own even, whenever the UNP is in power is when we see large-scale communal violence in the country. And I think Danu touched base on these Islamic radicals and the atrocities they committed. The question I'm posing is, do you think there is a direct link between the growing of anti-Islamic sentiment in the country, the fact that those actually turned into open violence, and this radicalization? Is there a direct link?
Well, I think the anti-Islamic sentiments which were expressed recently are quite new to Sri Lanka. Although we had anti-Muslim riots, before independence, just once in Sri Lanka, in Sri Lanka's history, we haven't had anti-Muslim riots thereafter. It has never been an issue. It has never been a topic on newspaper. It has never been, the subject matter of a political speech. But now it is, unfortunately. So what I feel is that there is also a level of political mileage people want to gain by spreading radicalization. Now, for an example, like what Danu said, now people are voting based on their caste or religion or language, which is something very primitive to do, when we talk about democracy. Because if a particular segment of people are voting for someone just because he represents their religion or their caste or their, language, I think that country will not do well as a democracy, or not do well economically as well. So what I feel is now one very interesting fact which I've been emphasizing at a lot of places is that when you look at people who instigate violence, when you look at people who promote terrorism, or people who promote communal hatred throughout the history of Sri Lanka, we see that most of them are from well-to-do families. For political mileage, they spread hatred. And then when you look at the victims of those violence, it's always people who are economically vulnerable. For an example, if you look at the leaders who spread, the idea of a Tamil state, had always been, people who had wealth, but they never got their children to fight in the, battlefronts. They never got their children to wear the cyanide capsule on their neck. Even in Sri Lanka, even in, when we talk about other instances, even today, in the political sphere today, what we see is people trying to radicalize or polarize people based on religion, ethnicity, or their caste, are always looking for political mileage over and over again. And this is becoming a highly problematic situation. And now people are, dependent on causing polarization for the election win. And that, I think, is something which is very negative, because countries which have some sort of multi-ethnic base have first got that sorted out if they want to develop. For an example, Singapore, which I believe as a really good model for Sri Lanka to follow, but they got that social cohesion done, and then they developed as a country. So Sri Lanka, we are still, we are still not there. And another thing which I personally believe should be done is we should have a ban on political parties which represent languages, religions, or ethnicities. So I think that is another a catalyst for polarization in Sri Lanka, because you have political parties which are, under a particular religion or a race. So you automatically tend to vote for that, based on your religious conviction or your love for your race or language. So I think that is again another catalyst which is pulling Sri Lanka's development backwards. So if we want to develop, or if you want to go forward in that line, I think we need to, our politicians need to stop polarizing people, and we need to have more, let's say, laws to, stop polarization in Sri Lanka.
I'd like to challenge you on that thought first and foremost, because this is my understanding from a background in ethnic studies. The so-called polarization that you are talking of political parties is merely the response to the fact that democracy seems to always uphold what we call the will of the majority. And in an ideal democracy, it is understood that the rights of the people with different opinions would be respected and honored. And it is only when we see a departure from this ideal democracy, which is obviously only going to exist in textbooks, that we see the rise of political parties representing minorities, simply because the minorities feel that they need they need that sort of protection. Because once again, I mean, if you look at Nazi Germany even, it was violence against minorities, because the Nazi Germany was pushing a very democratic model in the start, and we see the fact that they won elections, they came forward, and they basically had their two-thirds majority to overturn constitutions and to bring all these laws into place. So wouldn't you say that, so you are asking for the removal of these polarizing parties, but at what expense to the minority?
So what has these polarizing parties led Sri Lanka into? So you say this polarizing parties are, parties based on ethnicity or religion has been a solution for minorities in winning their rights. What rights have they gained throughout history? I don't see it as a solution for, for minorities regaining their rights or minorities fighting for their rights. What I see is politicians playing the ethnicity card, like Danu said, playing the religion card and coming into power and going back into parliament over and over again. But what we really need to see in Sri Lanka are political parties which are not based on religion or ethnicity. If we don't see don't see a change in that mindset, and if we continue to vote for someone of your race or your religion, and that is your consideration rather than the development of the country, then I don't see a positive future for the politics of Sri Lanka.
Anything to add on, Danu or Sashi? I'm sure there should be disagreement somewhere. So yes.
I think he took off from what I said, so I still stand on the same thing. Because in this general election, I had the opportunity to work with a few people who were contesting. Not that I was helping them to get votes, I was helping them from the back end in terms of what they should be doing. But every time I spoke to some of these people, they'll say, I have to somehow tap into the Christian votes. I have to somehow get the Tamil votes. Even that Tamil vote was broken into 3 sections of votes. The Jaffna Tamil Colombo votes, the Colombo Tamil votes, the Muslim Tamil votes. And I'm like, oh, there's so much to think here. And I thought to myself, why can't we exactly think of votes? But that's because nobody was strong enough to just get votes. Everyone is strong enough to get votes based on this. Now we don't speak about saying that, openly saying, I will vote for me, I will look after you specifically. But people do it and they go back to you and say, I voted for you because you are one of me. So it's there. I think we should stop it. And I think we can't stop it if we are going to be the ones who are going to vote for it as well and fall for it every single time.
Of course.
Yeah.
Thank you, Danu. To come back to Shehara, I'm sorry, I'm just going to polarize here myself. But just coming back to what we were discussing earlier, I think the initial question that was posed that perhaps wasn't entirely answered was whether acts of violence committed against an ethnicity is a direct cause, whether terrorism is merely the effect of the cause of which is acts of violence committed against ethnicity. I think we saw this in the massive growth of the LTTE in '83, and even if you push backwards, I think from a historical point of view, at the point of independence, there was no requirement for a Tamil state. And we saw the requirement for a Tamil state come on later on, because I mean, if you look at the British policy, when they left, they weren't very particular about where they drew their borders. If it was asked for, they would have very strongly considered it. And surprisingly, I was reading through an article, and actually there was a request for a separate state. Surprisingly, if we could have somebody guess from who requested a separate state, it was the Kandians. So Bernard Alvihare wrote a pamphlet of 58 pages where he said, Kandy deserves to be a separate state because they were never a state. That was United with Sri Lanka. In other words, it wasn't the Tamils who were asking for a separate state, it was the Kandian Sinhalese who wanted their own state. So in a system like this, wouldn't you say that terrorism was, I mean, the rise of separatist mentality was merely the response to post-independence discrimination? And I'd like you to apply that to today. I mean, before what we call this massive terrorist attack of the Easter bombs, we saw pocketed violence all throughout Sri Lanka. And I think there was a point when media was restricted from even going to the places, and we don't really know what really happened in those places. So what are your thoughts on this?
And of course, there is a correlationship between discrimination and rise in terrorism. One example I can give you is right after the anti-Muslim violence in Digana and in Alugama, in different areas of Sri Lanka, radical Islamic movements saw a rise in their membership.
Yes.
Why was that? Because once discrimination or hatred towards a particular group of people is targeted, then they feel they are victimized and they lose hope in the government, they lose hope in politicians, they lose hope in the democratic system. So then they need something to cling on to, because if they lose hope in the government, the country will not protect them. They need alternative protection mechanisms, so they are pushed into that situation. So that's what I thought Sri Lanka saw throughout history. Every time, like for example, like you said, in 1948 there was no issue of a separate Tamil state. Even great Tamil leaders like Ponnambalam Raghunathan, Ponnambalam Arunachalam were in the national freedom fight together with all other ethnicities, and there was no difference between them. And when discrimination started only, we see that different people started, different groups of people started, committing acts of violence against the state. So obviously there is a correlation between discrimination and emergence or rise of terrorism. So obviously, I mean, another one example I could give you is if you read Faslima Nasrin's lecture. It's a wonderful book, and that shows how someone just like you and me, who is pushed into raping another woman of the other race just because his sister got raped. So so once again, discrimination is the main catalyst for terrorism in the world, in Sri Lanka, which I think you can add on to it.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add on is that you can even see that kind of thing on a global scale. So after 9/11, it's a cycle, right? A never-ending cycle. So after a massive terrorist attack, which is fueled by extremism, there are stricter regulations, which means that sometimes they use racial profiling, which means that members of minorities feel that they are being unfairly targeted, and then fuels that kind of feeling where they feel that they are not being protected by their own state. So it's sad, and it's a cycle.
So just to build on what you all both were talking about, I'd like to actually harpoon on something that we've all noticed throughout this panel discussion. It is how everybody, I mean, despite the fact that Shehara said that anybody can commit an act of terrorism, when he was particularly describing the preambulatory violence to the rise of this Islamic terrorist attack in Colombo, the word constantly that was used was discrimination. Okay, and coming to that, I'd pose this question to Sashi, because I think this is valid on a global scale, especially when we take into consideration the recent Kenosha shooting. Why is it always that throughout the world we see the term terrorist being used so liberally, but always as an epithet to a minority? The moment we see a majoritarian, far-right extremist do something, that will always be tiptoeing around the exact nomenclature that you're going to use for this person. And what are your thoughts on that, Sashi?
Bias, both conscious and unconscious. It's because you are used to this stereotypical image of a terrorist, and so if someone from the majority group then commits an act which on paper you would deem a terrorist act or a violent act, you struggle to identify them as a terrorist because your idea of what a terrorist is doesn't look like them. And I think it's from deep-seated historical stereotypes, right? So with regard to that shooting, it's the way the media portrays a person of color and the difference between how they portray someone who's white. They don't identify them at the same level that they would identify a person of color. They don't brand them in the same way. And therefore, they're allowed to get away with a lot more. And you see, even with the way that the police responded to that 17-year-old boy, he was walking down the street with a rifle strapped to his back. And then it's so ironic to think that a black man was killed because they thought he might have a gun. But then you have a white man who has shot 3 people, 2 of whom died, who did have a gun. And it's just bias.
Does anyone want to add on maybe on a more local context? Because I think over the past few years, we have seen the rise of, a lot of majoritarian violence in Sri Lanka. We've seen churches being attacked, we've seen mosques being attacked, but whenever it is committed by a far-right extremist majoritarian group, the word used is there were clashes, but sometimes these were not merely clashes, these were just acts of violence perpetrated against victims who had no sense of self-defense and who did not put up a fight at all. So what are your thoughts on this, maybe Shehara and Danu?
But I think even in terms of, now we are all speaking about the Muslim issues that the country has faced in the last few months.
Just let me interrupt you there. I don't particularly think it's about the Muslims in general, because I think one of the most underreported violences that take place is violence against Protestant Christianity, which takes place across this country, perpetrated by mostly monks who are supposed to, by their own faith, advocate for tranquility and peace and non-violence, basically attacking mushroom churches across the country. I think Bishop Asiri came forward last year when he was attacked. And the only reason that got publicity was because he happened to be the bishop of the Methodist, president of the Methodist mission in Colombo, who was visiting a far-off place. But there is a regular thing. And yes, the Islamic violence, because this moved into large scale.
That's because there's a lot of global attention to it.
Yes.
But we have had this kind of discrimination against the Tamils till like last April, I would say. Because as a Tamil, I've been discriminated not by the people who I associate with, but people who have come up with this mindset. It could be somebody from, like when bombs used to go off, people looked at me as if I'm someone who is actually taking the bomb and planting it in a bus. Whereas I'm also as equally alarmed and shocked, or even in a vulnerable position to die, just as any other person. I think the problem is, the minute we know there is this that's creating a problem, we just put everyone in it. Then what happens is somebody who is not even in it wants to just get into it, or the fact that, okay, fine, so you're calling me this, let me just become a terrorist and show you. So it's one of those. So I think even if you take today, if you speaking about religion issues, I think I'll be just so much more happier if we all go back to the basic. And the minute a child enters a school, we tell the child, don't think of the medium, don't think of this, but think of the fact that this person is Sri Lankan. I think the education system is where it all boils down to, and that's the only way we can cultivate a newer thinking generation. But this happened in a very leading Catholic school in our country in the recent past. Grade 1 student from the Sinhala medium took two Sinhala students. Grade 1, they are barely 6, took a boy from grade 1 Tamil medium, but they were all studying in the English medium, so they kind of knew who was the Tamil, and they put red ants into his underwear. This is grade 1. When asked why, aren't Tamils bad? Where does it stem from? You don't because in my opinion that's an act of violence. That's just like, that's trying to create pain onto a child. So for a nearly 6-year-old person to understand that itself is shocking. So I think it has to start from the point. I would say even schools are the semi-government and government schools ask, like if it's a Catholic name, we give priority to them, but if you pay a bigger amount of money, we'll put you in. So there itself you have broken the system. There itself you have crippled, and people who are sometimes religious leaders who sit in the positions to even ask that amount of money, you have already made the parent think, oh, so just because I do not fall into this religion, you're asking me ₹1 million to put my child in. So there itself, I think it all boils down to the fundamentals of education. And if it's not in the home where you are made to think as one, at least in schools you have to made think as one. If that discrimination continues, I think it's just going to be a never-ending cycle. And in 10 years from now, there'll be 4 other people who sit and talk about the same thing, and we'll watch it from home.
Thank you, Danu. So just a very blanket question to everybody. Like, I know we've all said it, but do you think that the media needs to portray majoritarian acts of violence and very clearly label them as acts of terrorism when it takes place?
Yes, I think it's mentioned, but it's not. But we should also mention the fact that this is wrong as much as we want to. But I think it's mentioned in that way. But it's also right. So just because you watch a news bulletin, or just because you saw a post on your Facebook, you're not going to take a gun tomorrow and go and shoot. But it's the discussion that you have after that. It's the conversation that you build on. It's the comments that you write. Those are the things that could stop. It'll be terrible if you see let's say something against, hypothetically speaking, something against a Muslim, and you find a Muslim friend on your friend list and tag him or her and say, look, one of you, we are crippling this. Just during the attacks, when the bomb went off, one of my own classmates, who is a Muslim who was in a group, felt so isolated. All these other students were like, words that were very painful, and they all forgot that there is somebody who is from that religion there, who has played cricket with them, shared a meal, eaten watlapang together. All of those memories were shattered in 1 minute, whereas he felt isolated. He is not a part of this process. He is just somebody who was born into the religion. We as humans do not choose the religion we are born into, or the caste, or the race, or the language, or the skin color. So it's just the conversations that we build on. If it's a conversation that's going to lead somebody to think being extreme and being ridiculous then is normal, then I think we have all failed as people.
Thanks. So just, I think the answer that I was trying to draw out hasn't really come in. The question is, if a majority, as in the majoritarian ethnicity or the religion or the representation in the country, for example, let's if we look at America, if a white person commits what would be termed an act of violence with political ideology at its base, do you think that the media needs to explicitly say this was a terrorist attack and not just limit this label of terrorism to minority acts of violence with political agenda in it? Sashi, do you have a thought on it?
Yes, like I said, I think it's due to bias, both conscious and unconscious, within the media, that it isn't immediately labeled that. But I think now the world is changing, and we do have a broader definition of terrorism. We do have a broader approach to these types of acts of violence. And so I think, again, it's important to see every act of violence as an act against the entire country as a whole, not an act against any specific group. So if anyone is attacked, then everyone is attacked. You see it as a threat to your peace and security. And I think that's probably how you can then correctly term any attack against any group as a terrorist attack.
Thank you, Sashi. Just building on what you're saying, a question that I'd like to pose to Shehara. In 1983, under the watch of a then UNP government, we can all agree that what hit Colombo was turmoil. In hindsight, like Sashi said, now we are terming a lot of things in hindsight as terrorist attacks. Do you think that the 1983 riots, that it has been used, the word that has been used so far, needs to be replaced with the term terrorist attack in Colombo?
Well, definitely, because what we saw, I mean, not only in Colombo, but throughout Sri Lanka, were, and also, just to add to that, it was downplayed by media, and there is very little information on what exactly happened, how many died, what are the property damages which were caused, are downplayed to a level where, you don't really find information about the 1983 riots. So for me, as a citizen of Sri Lanka who want the government to protect me, just like everyone else, I would term it as a terrorist attack because you see organized mobs, well-organized mobs, planning and making attacks on groups of people, causing death, violence, property damage, so on and so forth. So for me, personally, 1983 was a terrorist attack.
Thank you. So, Danu, this is a question to you posed because of your background and your grassroots level activism. The question that I have to pose is, we saw a lot of build-up in the pre-LTT era of anti-Tamil discrimination. Do you see in your grassroots level activism, do you see a repetition of this, just this time with the Muslims at the forefront of targeted assault? Maybe something that has the potential to grow into a future organized terrorist organization that perhaps would be on par with the LTT and effect maybe equal or even greater damage to the unity of this country?
I surely hope no, but on the same lines, recently I interviewed students or like young youth from different walks of life. One boy who was born in an IDP camp, whose parents served in the LTTE, and this boy was made to believe that any Sinhala was there to kill him, and he has now reconciled, and one of his friends are from Matara, and the boy from Matara was someone. His opening line was to me, "Demile eknam kotiek," and that's how he was brought up. And another boy who is Muslim who spoke to me and said, "My neighbors threw pork into my house soon after the bombing." And I said, "How were they before?" Kisi prashnayak tibbena. Saturin hitiya. And these are half walls that they have between the two houses. So we should also understand to respect people as humans. If we don't, there's going to be this boy is smart enough to understand this is just a bump on a beautiful drive. If somebody sees as this is a stop to a beautiful drive, then definitely there'll be 2 or 3 idiots out there who will think, let's start something, and there'll be 10 other idiots who will think, yes, I'm for it, and let's go bomb someplace together. So I will not say it is not possible, I will say it is possible if we continue on these steps.
Thank you, Danu. So Shehara, just as in before I come on to the question of reparation in Sri Lanka, Sashi, could you give us a layout of international regulation and legislation rather? How does it cover reparation to victims of terrorism? Because today we are commemorating those victims and the families they left behind. What sort of form of reparations does international legislation require or mandate a state to perform?
I actually don't know about legislation regarding reparations, because legislation is more regarding what constitutes terrorism and then how terrorism is punished and things like that. But I think it's more of the social element. So how do we as a society move forward? And if you look to New Zealand, they have a great leader, I think, Jacinda Ardern. And I think her approach is really, really commendable, because her approach was, after that, to take it as, yes, it was an attack against a mosque, but it was an attack against New Zealand itself. Even if Muslims are a minority, in New Zealand, it's an attack to peace and security in New Zealand. And I think that's what you focus on, that social element of how a state moves forward after a terrorist attack. And it was very heartwarming, even in Sri Lanka, after the Easter bombs, we saw individuals from every ethnicity and every religion at risk to themselves lining up to donate blood to those affected by the Easter bombs. And I think that's what you focus on. You focus on unity, you focus on religious harmony, ethnic harmony. And it's not that you need specific laws to bring this in. You just need people who make friends outside their ethnic groups, who make friends outside their religious backgrounds, who are open to any individual regardless of their ethnic or religious background. And after an attack like the Easter bombs, I think you need to focus on strengthening ties between communities. So personally, I went to an international school, so everyone studied in English. It wasn't English medium, Sinhala medium, Tamil medium. And because of that, we all just made friends with people that we got along with. There was no, you didn't just make friends with Tamils or with Sinhalese people or with English-speaking people. Everyone studied in the same language, so I think the barriers between us were less. But moving forward after any sort of terrorist attack or any sort of ethnic or religious disharmony, I think the state and NGOs and just all civil society groups, all individuals should work towards increasing religious and ethnic harmony in any way they can within their own sphere of influence. They should work to strengthen ties with people from different backgrounds so that you're not desensitized to anyone. You don't see any group as the other. First and foremost, we are all citizens of a particular country. And that's more important. That should take precedence over what ethnicity we are, what religion we are, what language we speak, what food we eat at home, what sort of place of worship we attend. So that's how you need to strengthen ties between communities. That's how reparations take place.
Of course. Thank you, Sashi. And moving on from that, I think an important aspect of post-terrorism is helping people really rebuild their lives after everything that was lost. And coincidentally, yesterday I was actually at St. Sebastian's Katuapitiya. On my way back from Kilinochchi, I stopped there. And the church is a beautiful church, by the way. They've done it up apparently 10 times better than what it was before. And while this sort of rebuilding has taken place, I believe there's also a lot of memorialization. There were a lot of glass plaques that showed the actual damage that took place in that church. And there was also obviously wonderful memorials that have been built at I'm not really sure at whose expense, maybe the church or the state or maybe a mix of both. But one of the things when I was in conversation with the residents there, Shehara, was that they were talking about how, entire families have been decimated, and we found a lot of children maybe who were left orphans at the end of this violence. And there was a very strong promise made at the time by a senior politician, the head of the housing department, who had promised them all houses that would be built. And I think this was done with the donation of land by the Archdiocese of Colombo, that is Cardinal Malcolm Ranjit had donated the land. But they were talking about how from that point onwards there has been no progression. And while the church was built at great expense, their lives personally has merely been a downturn from that point onwards. And obviously by now funds have stopped flowing in from private organizations. So what do you think, where do you think these people need to move on from here? I think they're also in your electorate as well. Yes.
Yeah, so personally I've also visited Katuapitiya many times during the past year. And what I feel is, if you take that incident and also other incidents, is that always, the reason why we have a Day of Remembrance is that we always forget the victims of terrorism. Because after terrorist attacks are done, after an act of terrorism is over, you just repair the infrastructure, the political whatever turbulence which is caused is put back in order. But you always forget the victims of violence, which are mostly innocent people who with low income levels, or who can't really bring their lives back to where it was. So I think personally we need a system of assisting these people, because in Sri Lanka we really don't focus much on, economically is one aspect only. Okay, building, bringing their livelihoods back to normal, and ensuring that they have different avenues into progressing economically is one aspect. In Sri Lanka, we don't pay attention to mental health. Mental health is a serious issue in Sri Lanka. What we see is we don't really do well enough counseling for them to, regain that trust in the regain that trust among communities, and regain that, to revive from the shock which they have suffered. So what I think is, for people who are affected by the Easter Sunday bombings and people who have suffered violence throughout history of Sri Lanka, we have not, to begin with, we have not even given them an apology. the least we can do is to give them an apology, which has never taken place in our political system, which has never taken place under any government, where the government sometimes, should go and, see that, certain acts were a result of maybe government's inaction, or certain acts were, due to discrimination by the government. From there onwards, bringing them back into, of course, we have been having certain IDP camps and people are being given livelihoods, but, reparation is beyond something just economical. It should also be integration, it should also be mental health, it should also be physical health, but that doesn't happen in Sri Lanka. We don't have policies, we don't have legislation, and when an act on reparations were proposed, it was ridiculed and it never took place in Sri Lanka.
Thank you, Shehara. Sashi, just building on from that point and moving forward into counter-terrorism legislation that we discussed so far. So I think we all touched it at some point about how these systems have been misused by governments. On a global scale, could you give us a better understanding of how this actually takes place? So that maybe we could get Danu and Shehara to maybe dissect it on a very local scale.
Sorry, of how what takes place exactly?
Misuse of counter-terrorism legislation by governments to further personal agendas and discrimination against minorities, etc., etc.
I think it's very difficult to clearly brand as misuse. No government will act in a way that it thinks it is misusing its own legislation. That's too harsh, I think.
Okay.
It's more that they are in a difficult position where they have to balance threats to their national security with the requirement of upholding the rule of law and protecting the rights of their citizens and anyone who is suspected even. So I think it's like I said earlier, it's a grey area, it's a balancing act that they have to play, and it's not that they are consciously trying to target any particular group, but it's just that if you are trying to safeguard your own national security, you will do that to the best of your ability. Any country would. I'm not even speaking about any country in particular, but it's just that have states gone too far? Perhaps. But then how can you draw the line? How far is too far? But like I said earlier, that's why you have regulations regarding things like torture, so that even in trying to protect national security, there are some sorts of standards where no one is meant to torture. Anyone who's signed on to particular conventions that deal with that and that prohibit torture, those states are not permitted to torture. And so they don't have to balance that, because even with regard to counter-terrorism, that's not something they're supposed to do. So that's where international standards come into play.
Thank you, Sashi. Just moving on from that point towards a more relevant topic to the vast majority of our audience, who's obviously young people who's tuning into this. And what we'd like to confront is, this is my opinion again, I believe that terrorism seems to disproportionately affect the youth. I mean, even if you look at terrorists, I would like to think of them as victims of terrorism. People who have been radicalized and who have been drawn into a process, and therefore they themselves have been victimized. And therefore the crimes they perpetrate just merely expand this pool of victims. So what do you think the youth needs to do, as the young people need to do, to basically find a solution to terrorism? I mean, not merely in terms of legislation, but what can we do personally?
I think I'm sure the youth today understand what is right and wrong. It's just a matter of understanding what's right and following that. It's wherever you go, it's like when we are told don't drink and drive. So it's just like that. It's just, as much as we like to challenge the system as youth, we should also understand that certain things are not right and we should make way to being that. But I think on a broader perspective, I think the youth are mostly thinking on a more what can I say, a happier, more prosperous united country. But I think a few bad apples are good enough. But I think when you see the few bad apples, it's a matter of reporting, realizing it fast, acting on it. And I think it's just a matter of doing good, being good, and just associating with good is the only way forward.
Thank you, Danu. Sashi, your...
Like I said, make friends with people who are not from your community. Treat them with respect. If you have a friend or a family member who is, spreading hate speech or discriminating against any particular group, challenge them on it. It's not enough to just think that everyone should be equal and everyone should be treated equally. It's more difficult to actually voice those opinions when faced with people who actually spread a lot of hate speech and negativity. But I think the youth would have to play a more active role in challenging those sorts of opinions so that they can have meaningful discussions and maybe change the minds of people who are spreading that kind of thing in their lives, hate speech, discrimination, whatever it is. I think the youth should do more to challenge that, because it's not enough to just think it and then stay quiet at a family dinner if that weird uncle is being kind of rude about a minority group. It's not enough to just think it and know that you are better than them. Challenge them on it. Call them out on it. Speak to them. Introduce them to your friends from minority groups, or your friends from the majority group if you're in minority.
Of course. Thank you, Sashi. And Shehara, what is your opinion on what role the youth needs to play in making sure that terrorism is merely a vestige of the past?
I think more than any generation, the current generation of young people are actually interested in promoting, let's say, reconciliation, better protection of human rights than any other generation. So I think we need to make maximum use of it, and also we need to understand whenever someone wants to misuse young people, because that has always been, see, young people are always passionate, generally. So what we see throughout history is political leaders using that passion for their own ends. So we need to identify whenever that happens, and we need to oppose it openly and very brutally. That's one thing we can do. And also, as a country, I think young people can also propose and put forward different ideas in order for society to be better integrated. Now, she just mentioned that we need to have friends of different ethnicities, but how can we do that at the very inception itself? We have schools based on religion, language, and sometimes even economic barriers separate schools. So if you have that level of education, and it from the very initial stage of a grade 1 child, you put in that mentality, and then you can't expect people to be all happy and coexistent when they come out of school 13 years later. So starting from that, I think young people, personally, I think should be more politically interested also, because they need to oppose or speak up whenever there is a wrong decision taken by the government or the opposition. So better involvement of young people in politics would be another possible, a very progressive step forward.
Thank you, Shehara. So actually, you have been the runt of most of our toughest questions, of course, because of your political background, and we really saved the worst for last, and I didn't even put it on the paper because I was afraid if you saw it, you wouldn't turn up. But you contested Parliament recently, and there is a strong sentiment amongst the youth about how we lack representation in the legislation, despite being a massive part of the workforce and a massive part of the population of the country. And credence has to even go to politicians across the spectrum, people like Namal Rajapaksa and BPC, even in their politics. Yourself, there are so many others. Even Thondaman's son has proven to be cut above the rest, reflective more of our politics and the way we want to respond to situations. So obviously, there's been a lot of pressure, I suppose, to see you consistently on the ballot list, because that is the sort of initiation we need from young people who are willing to go out there and really put themselves out there. So the question that I have to ask you is, did you make this detour into politics, because of the realization that you look very good in a white Chinese collared shirt?
Well, except for that fact. What really prompted, I mean, it's a very, I think you're bringing this conversation to a very personal level. But what I personally think is young people should get involved in politics. Not only contesting is just one, minor part of being a politically active citizen. You should also be very vocal on media. You should be very, involved with politicians. You should meet them. You should question them. You should oppose them whenever necessary. So that level of activism is what I expect from young people to do. Saying that, I also don't think that a good politician is always a young politician. It could be someone who is old school. That doesn't matter at all. The age doesn't matter in politics. But the real reason why I think young people should be in parliament, why young people should be in politics, is because one thing is, of course, they are underrepresented, because you see about 26% of our population being young people, but in parliament it's less than 5%. Secondly, what I think is, like you said, the younger generation is more conscious about the environment, more conscious about fundamental rights, more conscious about creating a better Sri Lanka than the other generations. I don't know whether I'm biased towards my generation, but that's what I feel. So in that context, deciding to contest is just one step in my political activism. I mean, I could have decided to support another candidate, or I could have decided to be just vocal as I was prior to contesting elections. So I don't see a difference, but what I feel is I would always welcome young people to contest and also to be politically active in whatever sphere.
And they can also stay awake in parliament.
Of course. And just one last question before we wrap up everything. I think today we discussed in the alleviation of terrorism in the world, and things like education, things like economic progression, things like a lot of what we would call maternal care needs to be directed into the system. And Sashi, what are your opinions on a global scale? I think if we look at the best responses and the best national stances in the anti-terrorism field, we see at the forefront of them strong female leaders, people like Jacinta Ardern, people like the Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, and we see this form of maternal care that doesn't segregate society. Do you think that perhaps there is also one of the other causes of terrorism being so prevalent and rising is the lack of this feminine touch in politics?
No, I think ascribing their femininity as one of the reasons why they're good leaders is wrong to begin with. They're good leaders because they have a good approach, not because they're women. The same way that if they were in any other field, they would be good because of their experience, because of their skills, not because of their gender. I think it's playing into gender stereotypes to say that because they are feminine, they bring a feminine touch and that's why they're doing good. No, they have good approaches because they just tackled the issues that they had in a very effective way. I wouldn't say it's to do with gender, it's because they are capable, not because they're women, but because women are capable, if that makes sense. So it's not, terming them as good female leaders is missing the point. They are just good leaders. The same way a man can be a good leader, a woman can be a good leader. And that's with regard to any field. It's not because they're women that they're good. It's just that they are good and they happen to be women.
Of course. Thank you, Sashi. And on that
Love
note,
the answer.
Thank you.
Of course, that was quite a burn. So yes. And moving on from that, before we conclude, what message do each of you all want to give our audience today? Or we passed that already, of course. So with that, we've come to the end of this evening's segment. I'd like to thank Sashi, Shehara and Danu for joining us this evening. We'd also like to thank everyone who sent in their questions. There were quite a lot. We've merged in a lot. I mean, some of you would have heard your questions being asked outright. Some of you would have heard a form of your question being asked. But we'd like to thank you for tendering in those questions. We'd also like to thank the organizing committee for pulling this together. Special thanks to the chairpersons, that is Rotractor Anuja Chirat and Shehani Alubihare, who really spearheaded this program together with Angela Hettige. And with that, we'd like to wish you all a very good evening, and God bless you all.